All right, so we keep in the conversation with regard to what's happening around the world and even here in Trinidad and Tobago. And on the line, I have Amilca Sanatan, who is an instructor in the Department of Geography and PhD candidate for Cultural Studies at the University of the West Indies. No stranger to the program. Good morning, Amilca.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for having me here.
And thank you for joining us. So it's 150 years post the abolition of slavery and, of course, the civil rights movement in the 60s. Why are we seeing these images, the same images, so to speak, coming up in 2020?
The reason why we have to confront these challenges, this is what we call structural racism. Racism is not just an individual attitude, it is the systemic oppression of people, the use of public policies, cultural representations, and how it informs the social outcomes and disadvantages for people. Structural racism is difficult to overcome and transform.
Yes.
Cannot be done overnight, but each generation must answer that call.
And you talk about structural racism. Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and Charles V. Hamilton first used the term in 1967, where they talk about institutional racism. It's less perceptible because of its less overt, far more subtle nature. Institutional racism originates in the operation of established and respected forces in the society and thus receives far less public condemnation than individual racism. How relevant, you spoke about structural racism, institutional racism being embedded in the laws of the country. Can we legislate against racism?
Legislation forms an important arm of the battle against racism and the battle for racial justice. But legislation oftentimes does not change our hearts. Cultural discourse, dialogue, public events, gatherings, perspectives. Our watchwords in Trinidad and Tobago are discipline, tolerance, and production. Greater than tolerance or beyond tolerance is a thing called understanding. And to appreciate cultural difference, our different histories, our pain, our traumas, but our shared collective goals and the way that we share our space becomes more important.
And let's bring it home to Trinidad and Tobago a bit. It's a difficult conversation to have, but from the reactions on social media, and you would have seen, maybe, I don't know if you saw the conversation I had with Anya Cannell and Charlie Reed just now with regard to the young members of the white and Syrian community confronting their elders. The conversation has started. The underbelly of Trinidad and Tobago has been exposed. We've seen the posts on social media last week. How do you interpret what's happening right here in Trinidad and Tobago?
This is a very important conversation that we are having here in Trinidad and Tobago. Fundamentally because this is 50 years after the Black Power Revolution in Trinidad and Tobago. More than just 50 years after the Black Power Revolution, every generation must reflect on itself. So one, the self-conscious reflection by non-African people to think about anti-Black racism is important on one hand, but also young people saying that when they work in insurance and financial institutions and the supervisor or HR says, you look unprofessional, but that is because you wear an African natural hairstyle, or they have a problem with the smell of the chemicals or the oils in your hair. That is a form of racism we experience today. When we see the social outcomes for young Black men in impoverished communities and under-resourced communities, where they are the subject of scrutiny and police violence, yes, done by people who have my complexion, who look like me. That is a form of racial contempt. And when we see we have young academics who grow up from Trinidad and Tobago, go to the UK or the US and perform well and succeed, get their PhDs and look for a job, they are underrepresented when they become tenured faculty. That is a form of racism. So racism is all around us, not just individual attitudes, but our social and economic outcomes.
Now let's sort of deconstruct this a little bit, because we're talking about racism, Black against white, white against Black. But even right here in Trinidad and Tobago, we are dealing with, beyond that, we're talking about colorism even within our community, you know, who is darker, who is fairer. We have something called agency brown when, you know, when we look at the advertisements on television and so on. How does that play out in terms of our own cultural identity, our own self-love, self-hate? What are your thinkings about that?
Well, hierarchies exist in all society. Hierarchy is a big way to refer to the social organization, the levels to which we value people unequally, the status we give to them. And Trinidad and Tobago, like many Caribbean countries, is about 50 shades of brown. We talk about 50 shades of gray. Welcome to 50 Shades of Brown. And I'm someone who has experienced largely from the value people get to brown skinned persons, or what we call khaki people
Yeah.
sometimes. But if you look at the television or read the newspaper, you would imagine that no dark skinned person either drinks milk or takes loans, because we always value a certain color complexion, and that is about its proximity to
Yeah.
whiteness. And if not its proximity to whiteness, its distance from blackness.
Yeah.
And even though we became an independent society and we put darker skinned persons and Africans and Indians into political leadership, what we did not transform is the racist attitudes to African culture and Indian culture and non-whiteness.
And how do you anticipate that we can go about changing that narrative?
A lot of that work has been done in the Independence Project. The fact that I look the way I look and you look the way you look, and we talk on TTT, state programming, where subject material and content looks like me and comes from my culture is important. But we need to go beyond the idea that social reforms inadvertently get groups across the line, that policies which appear to be racially blind means it is more racially equal. Understanding different outcomes for Africans, Indians, whites, Syrian, Lebanese, Chinese are very important, and we need to put race into our conversation of the society. Acknowledging race becomes important, not saying that we are blind to it.
Yeah, because we talk about rainbow country, all are we as one, and all of that. But is that being hypocritical? Is that being in denial? Is that a fear of confronting what exists in our community?
There are days when all are we is one, but there are years when all are we is not one. And I love that I live in a multicultural society, and many of us are products of the fact that we coexist in a space, and some of us become mixed, and some of us mix our cultural attitudes, practices, and cosmologies and beliefs. But what we cannot ignore is that the persons who are at the bottom of the social stratum, at the bottom of the ladder, are African people, and poor black people in particular. So a multicultural society as an ideal has its utilities and the way that we try to get along to each other and celebrate our pride. But we cannot use multiculturalism to blind ourselves from the reality of specific groups or even abuse countries, such
Yeah.
as countries which are all black. I think part of the contempt and the condescension that comes from Trinidad to Tobago sometimes it's because it is a larger African majority population.
Interesting. Now, Amilka, you know, there are those who have come out and said and continue to say that yes, you are at the bottom of the ladder because you're lazy, you know, you don't want to go to school. When you look at the fights, it's predominantly of one particular ethnic background. What do you say to those persons who suggest that if you want to, if you know, if you work hard, you will reap the benefits of your hard work?
That yes, individuals have a responsibility to an extent in their lives, but I didn't wake up this morning and drink orange juice and eat quinoa as a black person. I was just drinking orange juice and quinoa. For all the standard English I could speak and the education that I have, I am seen as a threat at night. I am questioned when I walk through immigration. There's no country in the world that is excited to see someone like me. There's no immigration office where I skip the line. So this idea that as individuals, they are entirely responsible for the outcomes in their lives or the responses that they get from other people is patently false. And we need to understand that racism is systemic and it's about historical inequalities which privilege certain persons and disadvantage others, and oftentimes disadvantage blacks, including darker skinned Indians, including persons who are poor whites and perceived as rich on the basis of their whiteness. This is a feature of the structural inequalities that exist in our society.
Now, hashtag All Lives Matter caused an eruption last week, but there are some people who say, "But all lives matter. Why would you get upset if I say all lives matter?"
And all lives are relevant and significant. But we don't need a Trinidad Lama here, or we're not asking, do the principles of Gandhi or Jesus are valued? We believe in the human struggle and value all human life. But all suffering is real, but suffering is not equal. Different groups suffer disproportionately, and black people as a social category suffer the most in our society and have a certain type of racism they experience, and other groups experience it. So all lives matter cannot force our solidarity to say that Black lives are less significant and we must extend our love to everyone. Right now, Black people are struggling for dignity in their lives. And to assert that all lives matter is counterproductive to a specific group fighting for dignity and justice in this moment.
Mm-hmm. What about Black privilege? We have just a few remaining moments, but let's talk about Black privilege. Spoke about white privilege, but there's a conversation that surfaced on social media this weekend about Black privilege, about persons who are Black but have grown up with a certain level of privilege and perhaps not identifying or understanding what is taking place with other Black people who may not have access to loans as they have, or perhaps live in communities that they would have grown up in. How do you speak to that?
Well, I will not use the term Black privilege. Blackness in this Western capitalist Babylon system does not give us any privilege in the end that protects us. We see Black CNN reporters would speak standard English and show their ID and be subject to being arrested. We see a former Trinidad and Tobago US ambassador to Trinidad and Tobago be subject to harassment and scrutiny. We see professors would be calling who enter in their house are calling to ask if they actually live there. So I don't think there's Black privilege, but the point you're making is about class privilege. And Black middle class persons, especially persons who identify with the Afro-Creole narrative of Trinidad and Tobago, need to do a lot more to disrupt, interrogate, and really question that idea of Blackness and support African cultural practices, African spirituality, African communities, including working class Blacks. That is where my solidarity is at. Working class Black people, and not just everyone who has my complexion is my comrade.
Right. Well, Amilcar, always so, thought-provoking and thoughtful in terms of your presentation, and, really wonderful that you can join us this morning and help us to, ventilate some of the issues that we've been grappling with. How can we change this narrative as we go forward? I just can give you 45 seconds. I know it's not enough time, but in 45 seconds, what can we do?
No problem. I could do it less. And what we need to do is, one, listen. What we need to do is show solidarity to the young people who are not just all Africans, but especially African people, young people throughout the world who are raising awareness. And we could initiate a conversation about interracial solidarity and how we respect the dignity of the many different races we have in Trinidad and Tobago. And we could start with the one Black people have left.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Amilcar. And once again, all success with your PhD in Cultural Studies that you're doing at the University of the West Indies. And he's also an instructor in the Department of Geography. We're going to kick it upstairs where Vidya is on standby for the news, and we'll come back after that.